Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Have you ever thought about how a big university can totally change the city around it?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Well, that's what we're looking at today,
Yeah.
the relationship between Johns Hopkins and Baltimore.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically, we're focusing on real estate
Okay.
and how it can get a little messy sometimes.
Yeah.
So, to set the scene a bit, Johns Hopkins is a huge deal in Baltimore,
Right.
economically and just like physically taking up space.
Yeah, they are.
They're actually the biggest tax-exempt property owner in the entire city.
Wow. That's wild.
I know, right?
Yeah,
And that comes with, well, complications.
definitely.
Like, on one hand, Johns Hopkins says they bring in something like $7.3 billion to Baltimore's economy.
Okay.
But then on the other hand, you've got people saying they're pushing out longtime residents
Oh, yeah.
and driving up prices.
Gentrification.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a super controversial topic, so in this deep dive, we're going to break it all down, looking at different sides of the story. So by the end, you'll have a better understanding of what's going on.
Yeah.
All right, so let's start with maybe the biggest example of this tension. The East Baltimore Development Incorporated project.
EBDI.
Yeah, or EBDI for short. This was a huge project.
Massive. We're talking 88 acres
Wow.
and a budget of $1.8 billion.
Whoa.
One of the biggest developments Maryland's ever seen.
Okay, so what exactly was EBI supposed to do?
The idea was to revitalize this part of East Baltimore, new housing, green spaces, attracting investment,
Okay, so like a big makeover for the neighborhood.
basically, yeah.
And I read that Ronald Daniels, who was president of Johns Hopkins at the time, saw this project as like a really big part of his legacy.
Oh, yeah, for sure. He even said that if EBDI failed, his whole presidency at Hopkins was a failure.
Wow, so like a lot was riding on this.
A lot. But the reality is, well, it's complicated.
Okay, how so?
Like, around 900 residents, mostly black families, were displaced because of the project.
Oh, wow. According to the Hopkins Teachers and Researchers United.
So there were some serious downsides, despite what it promised.
There were. And to really understand this, we got to talk about Ralph Moore.
Okay, who's Ralph Moore?
Well, he's a Hopkins alumnus and an activist
Okay.
who's been fighting for the residents who were displaced by EBDI.
Gotcha.
He talks about how EBDI promised people this right of return,
Okay.
saying they could come back to new affordable housing once the project was done.
So, like, they'd get to come back to their neighborhood after all the construction and stuff?
That was the idea,
Mm.
but it didn't really work out that way.
Okay.
Well, Moore said that a lot of people were moved out of houses that were worth around like $70,000,
Okay.
and then they were told they could return to homes that were now worth like $250,000.
Whoa.
Yeah,
That's a huge jump in price.
right. It's not really affordable anymore.
No.
And a 2018 investigation by the Baltimore Sun found that, get this, only 1 in 10 of the displaced residents actually returned.
Or even plan to return to the new development, which is called Eaker Park.
So the right of return was kind of an empty promise.
Pretty much. And the Hopkins Teachers and Researchers United put it really bluntly.
What did they say?
They said, and I quote, Hopkins razed the neighborhood to the ground, sitting on empty lots for years before gentrifying the area for predominantly wealthy white residents. Hopkins continues to ignore the voices of those it has forcibly displaced in its expansion at the expense of the most vulnerable communities of Baltimore. Wow. Strong words.
Yeah.
And it gets at this bigger issue, which is that EBDI isn't an isolated incident.
Oh, really?
It seems like part of a pattern for Johns Hopkins,
Okay.
buying up properties and then not really having a clear plan for them.
Like they're just collecting buildings?
Yeah, kind of.
All right, well, let's get into some other examples then, so we can see this pattern in action. I know you've got some more info on that, so let's take a quick break,
Sounds good.
and we'll be right back. So it's kind of like they're playing Monopoly with real estate in Baltimore.
Yeah, and sometimes it feels like they're not even trying to pass a boo or collect their $200.
Oh, I see what you did there.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so give us some more examples of this pattern of Johns Hopkins buying properties and then, well, not doing much with them.
Okay, so one that stands out is the Dell House in Charles Village.
The Dell House.
Mm-hmm. They bought it way back in 2003, used it for a bit, and then, well,
And then,
it's been vacant since 2010, just sitting there,
yeah,
empty.
seriously, for over a decade.
Yep. And get this, now they're planning to demolish it.
Wait, what? Why would they do that?
It's a head scratcher, right? especially when affordable housing is such a huge issue in the city.
It is. It seems like such a waste.
Totally.
It's like they're saying, oh, we don't need this perfectly good building. Let's just tear it down.
Pretty much. And it's not just the Dell House. There's also the case of the West 29th Street row houses.
Row houses, huh? So like historic homes.
Exactly. And Hopkins started buying them up in 2000.
2000s. This has been going on for a while.
Yeah, they kept buying them up until 2019. And then, despite a lot of pushback from the community,
They demolished them.
yep, in 2022, they said it was for safety reasons.
So they let these historic properties sit there and decay for years and then decide the best solution is just to knock them down.
That's what it looks like. And I know J.B. Bird from Hopkins Media Relations said the houses were too unstable to fix up and that there was a big risk of fire.
I guess that makes sense on some level, but still. It's hard not to see this as them prioritizing their own interests over what the community wants.
Yeah. It kind of goes back to what Ralph Moore was saying about control. Owning these properties gives them the power to decide what to do or what not to do.
And in these cases, it seems like years of doing nothing had a pretty big impact on the neighborhoods around these properties.
For sure.
Okay, so we've talked about EBDI, the Dell House, those row houses. What other examples do we have of this kind of thing happening?
Well, let's shift gears and talk about Charles Village.
Okay. Charles Village, the neighborhood right next to Homewood campus.
Yep. Over the past 20 years or so, it's gone through a big transformation.
How so?
Well, it used to be mostly residential, homes, families. But now it's way more commercial.
Oh, so like more businesses and stuff.
Exactly. And guess who's been driving that change?
Johns Hopkins, I'm assuming.
Bingo! They've been buying up properties left and right.
Leading to longtime residents and businesses being pushed out.
Unfortunately, yeah. And this is something Ralph Moore talked about, too. He mentioned Eddie's Market.
Eddie's Market.
It was this really beloved grocery store in Charles Village, kind of a community hub.
Okay.
But it got replaced by a streets market in 2021. And Moore talked about how Eddie's was this place where everyone felt comfortable shopping, rich, poor, everyone. And its closure, well, it symbolizes that loss of community.
And affordability probably too.
Yeah,
It's always sad to see those local places disappear.
it is. And it doesn't seem like Hopkins is slowing down with the acquisitions.
They just keep buying more and more.
They do. Recently, they bought the Alpha Delta Phi house, the one that used to have the WA in it.
Oh, yeah, I remember that place.
And they also bought the Academy on Charles, which is a big apartment complex.
Like I've seen that one. It's right on Charles Street, right?
Yeah, right there. And Hopkins says these purchases are all about student housing, part of their 10-for-1 framework or whatever.
Right, I've heard about that.
But what's interesting is that J.B. Bird, the spokesperson for Hopkins, admitted that they don't have any concrete long-term plans for these properties yet.
So it makes you wonder if it really is just about student housing or if it's more about them just wanting to own more property in the city.
Yeah. It definitely raises some questions.
It does, especially when you consider that Johns Hopkins doesn't pay property taxes like everyone else,
That's right. They're tax exempt.
which is a whole other issue we need to unpack.
Definitely. It's a big one.
Okay, so let's dive into that. But first, another quick break. We'll be right back to talk about the elephant in the room. Johns Hopkins tax-exempt status. It's a big question, right?
Right.
Like, what would actually change if Johns Hopkins had to pay their fair share?
Oh, yeah. It could be huge for the city. I mean, think about it. What if a big chunk of that money, they're not paying in property taxes, went right back into Baltimore?
Okay, yeah, walk me through that. What would that look like?
Well, for starters, we could see more affordable housing being built, housing that people who already live here can actually afford.
Makes sense. That's definitely a major need in Baltimore.
Right. And we could see investments in small businesses, local businesses, creating jobs for people in the city.
So instead of just providing jobs at the university, they'd be helping to build up the whole local economy.
Exactly. And think about community projects, too, like parks and rec centers, things that people in the neighborhoods really need.
And with that money, they could actually make those things happen.
They could. Instead of these big decisions about what a neighborhood needs being made by, people who don't even live there, residents could have a real say in how their communities are developed.
That's a pretty powerful idea.
It is. But of course, Johns Hopkins is a powerful institution. They're going to have their own ideas about how things should be done.
Right. It's not like they're just going to roll over and say, okay, do whatever you want with our money.
Definitely not. But I think this whole WUFU proposal, it's not about trying to make Johns Hopkins the bad guy.
No, it's more about, like, trying to create a better relationship.
Yeah. A partnership where the university's success is tied to the success of the whole city.
Like breaking down that town and gown divide.
Exactly. And that's why this conversation is so important. It's
Mm.
happening in Baltimore, but it's really a bigger issue that cities all across the country are dealing with.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
How do we make sure these big institutions are actually accountable to the communities they're part of?
Right. How do we ensure they're contributing in a way that benefits everyone, not just themselves? And that's where you, our listeners, come in.
Because this is a complex issue.
It is. And we've only just scratched the surface here.
So what we really want you to do is keep thinking about this.
Yeah.
Learn more about WUFU, their proposal, and get involved in these conversations.
Because ultimately, this is about people,
Real people's lives,
their neighborhoods,
their futures.
and that's what matters most.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Johns Hopkins and Baltimore. We hope this is giving you a lot to think about, and that you'll continue to explore these issues and get involved in shaping your own community.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive.